Hey everybody, what's going on? Hexlex here. Got another Master Duel video for y'all. So today we're going to be taking a look at a meta-analysis, which we haven't done in a little bit. I wanted to wait a little bit, at least a couple of weeks, for sprites to be in the meta before we decided to dissect Master Duel meta, see what Diamond 1 decks were submitted, and see what that kind of snapshot of the metagame looks like. Now, as always, I do want to kind of clarify when doing these meta-analysis that the data is compiled from the Diamond 1 decks that have been submitted to Master Duel meta. It's going to be 292 decks total for these past couple of weeks. Due to that, we are only looking at a small snapshot of what is being represented in the meta. And the other thing you got to remember too is that, you know, because this is obviously like a kind of TCG side website, that the submissions are going to be from people who play in like the TCG regions, like North America, Europe, so on and so forth. So we do have to keep that in mind. We're not looking at the complete meta by any means when we're looking at these meta-analysis, but this is the data that we have available, and we can at the very least analyze that. So with that little caveat out of the way, I wanted to first start by looking at the last meta-analysis that we did. This was for decks across the entirety of Diamond Rank, not just Diamond 1, that were submitted from January 10th to the 24th. So it's been definitely about a month or so since we took a look at the metagame here. We did do a little bit of a meta-analysis for like some Master Circuit Series tournaments, but this is again looking exclusively at Diamond ladders. So last season, pretty much pre-Spright, this is pretty close to, you know, what we were seeing overall, with Mathmech being by far the most represented Tier 1 deck, Sword Soul, and I was going to say Branded Despia coming up behind it, but in this particular case, looks like Sky Striker is coming up behind it. So this was the meta-analysis most closely following the release of Circular and Linkage. So that's why we're seeing like a lot of Sky Striker here, but Branded Despia soon moved back up over Sky Striker. And then, yeah, we have the usual suspects after that, like, right, Flaunderies, Dragon Link, Adagnister, Dinomorphia. Sun Avalon was mostly due to Therions being released, is why that saw, like, a huge spike in play. And then Runic, so on and so forth. So, again, this is what we were seeing before Sprites came out. Not the exact window of time, but generally still pretty accurate. So what followed once, well, Sprites hit? I think we all know it by this point, but let's just go ahead and take a look at this anyway. So this is the chart for the Post-Spright Season 4 Diamond 1 decks. These are decks that specifically hit Diamond 1, the top rank in the game. And these are decks that hit from, oh, this is actually there's a bit of a typo here. This should be the 13th to the 27th. So, I mean, pretty much the 14th as well. But yeah, it's decks from the 13th to the 27th, these last 2 weeks that Sprites have been out. So, looking over here at the percentages, we're seeing, to no one's surprise, Runic Spright is on top at a whopping 21.9%. That's actually insane. I don't know that we've seen a deck represented quite that high in any of these like Master Duel like meta reports. Yeah, 21.9% is a lot. That's a lot. Especially when you look at the next most represented deck below it, which is going to be, I just have it as Spright. It's like a pure Spright. So that's with, you know, the Swap Frogs, and then another level 2 engine, usually Nimble Beaver, or Dark Beckoning Beast, or Deep Sea Diva, so on and so forth. That's coming in at 8.6%. So to 21.9, it's 8.6. That's an over 13% gap between the top meta deck and the one that comes right after it. So wow, that is quite a bit. But it's honestly not really surprising. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more in depth a little bit later on in the video, but I suspect that there are two major factors why Runic Spright is so highly represented above all the other decks. One is that Runic Spright is a solved deck. So what does that mean? A solved deck is one where it's not even necessarily that there's not a lot of room for tech choices, but it's pretty easy to figure out like the best way to build this deck, right? Or at least mostly. With Runic Spright, you're generally going to be playing the same, like about 35 cards, honestly closer to like 36 every single time. And then it's like just those last 4 slots, 3 or 4 slots that usually come down to like Lava Golem versus Triple Tactics Talent versus some other tech. But by and large, it's a lot like Sword Soul Tenyi, right? Like Sword Soul Tenyi went mostly pretty much entirely unchanged throughout the course of its existence on Master Duel, save for when Halki Fibrax got banned. But even then, the deck really did not change much at all. Sword Sultani is another great example of a solved deck. So Runic Spright is also a very solved deck. The other factor that I do think plays into this at least a little bit is kind of what I touched on a little bit at the start of this video, where I do need to remind everyone that we are looking at Diamond 1 decks that are submitted TCG side, and I think there is something to be said for TCG bias, or like bias towards decks that have performed well in the TCG as opposed to ones that have performed well in the OCG. So Runic Spright is a deck that was already very popular before Sprites, with TCG players, that is. It was already a deck that was very popular with TCG players before Sprites actually came out on Master Duel, and Runic Spright is, TCG side very much the way to play it. So I think in addition to the deck's high power level, that is why players have tended to gravitate towards it. Now, I'm not saying those are the only reasons Runic Spright is the best deck right now. I think overall it probably just is the most powerful deck, but I don't think it's by as wide of a margin as the figures here would lead you to believe. So that's just my 2 cents on it, but I think that Runic Spright is, to be fair, all Spright variants are probably going to be slightly overrepresented in this particular graph because this data is from immediately following the release of Spright into the metagame. So yeah, in that regard, I think that Spright overall is going to be a little bit overrepresented here. Only a little bit though, like very slightly. Spright and its variants are definitely still just the most powerful decks in the game. I'm honestly surprised to see Twin Spright as high as it is, not just because I think the deck is bad or anything. And I've talked about this before on the channel. Twin Spright is by far the variant I have the least experience with. I just have not come up against it, like, at all. Not obviously, like, not literally at all, but I've come up against it less than Tri-Spright, just in my testing. I can definitely tell you that. That might be because, like, by the time Sprites came out, I'd already hit Diamond 1, but that definitely didn't stop people from using, like, Runic Spright and Pure Spright in Diamond 1. So I don't know. It's probably just, like, my own kind of personal bias. It is something that we always have to keep in mind. And one reason why I really like looking at the hard data like this is that it's really easy for me to make a statement like, oh, I never run into Twin Spright, therefore Twin Spright must not be that good. That's a very flawed kind of line of logic in my opinion. I think we should be looking at beyond just our own experiences, but as many collective experiences as we can in order to make like a good assessment about a deck's place in the meta. We got Branded Despia coming up behind these Spright variants here, coming in at 5.1%. It's nice to see Branded Despia still hanging in there, and it's not surprising either. Branded Despia is one of those decks that has such a high skill ceiling. I honestly laugh every time I see people insult it by calling it Brain Dead Despia, because nothing could be further from the truth. Branded Despia does have a fairly low skill floor in that it's not a hard deck to learn the basic lines, but when it comes to like playing this deck consistently and winning consistently in a variety of situations beyond just your turn 1 combo, that's where the deck has a much higher skill ceiling than its floor would indicate. So Branded Despia, I suspect the reason we're seeing it represented to this degree above stuff like Sword Soul, like, Sword Soul isn't even on this. Like, Sword Soul is going to be actually in our other category, which is wild to me that Sword Soul didn't even make like the list. It didn't make it out of the other category this week. Now, I don't think that Sword Soul is like weaker than all these other decks, but that is very telling that we're seeing Branded Despia here and not Sword Soul. I think one of the main reasons for that is that a lot of the current Branded Despia players, I just noticed this from like talking with some other Branded Despia players, particularly those who've been participating in the MCS, they're often like enfranchised players. And what that means is that like, they commit to this one deck and they play it all the time, and it's just about all they play, which in Branded Despia's case is very rewarding because, again, the more you play with it, the closer you can get to that deck's very high skill ceiling. So it's not surprising to me to see Branded Despia here, but it is surprising to not see Sword Soul. Again, we'll talk about that here more in a little bit. Following Branded Despia is Exo Sister coming in at 4.1%. It's not surprising, the deck is new, and it's pretty good. Martha was definitely some very much needed support, as well as the Xyz monster that's 2 rank 4s. Just in general, the deck got a lot of really nice support to help smooth out its consistency. And I would expect to keep Exosister on your radar as we get closer to the release of stuff like Tier Limits and the Ishizu cards, because this deck will only get more relevant against other meta decks as time goes on. After that, we've got Mathmech coming in at 3.8%. Also not particularly surprising to me. It's actually just a little surprising in that I would have expected to see Mathmech a little bit higher, but it's also not surprising in that a lot of people who were on Mathmech consistently are probably now on Sprite consistently. Like me, I'm very much one of those people. So, but Mathmech is still an extremely good deck in this meta. Not just solid, it's still a very good deck. I would definitely put it at like the top of tier 2. I think it's still above Twin Sprite, honestly, in terms of power level. I think it's close. Now that I guess I'm seeing a little bit more hard data on Twin Sprite, I still don't have the personal experience to make that call, but I think it's close between those two. Following that, we have Punk. This is just kind of like encompassing a lot of different Punk variants. This 3.8% here, but if a deck ran a significant Punk engine, from what I could tell, it was included, lumped in with the other Punk decks. Again, not surprising, not only because they are new cards, but Deer Note. Deer Note was such a huge addition to the deck that it really made the engine just flourish, and it's a lot more viable now. Mostly, not even just mostly, but a lot, because it's a lot easier to get level 8 synchros now with Deer Note and Xeamine, so on and so forth. Dinomorphia at 3.1%. I'm startled to see that here. I did not expect to see Dinomorphia this high up at all, let alone above stuff like Sword Soul and Sky Striker, but here we are. We live in a world where even post-Spright, Dinomorphia is still just as viable as it was before Spright hit. This is pretty much exactly where it was on the last tier list and the tier list before that as well. So Dinomorphia looks like Rexstrom is actually enough, which isn't surprising in a best of 1 format. But yeah, Rexstrom is enough to keep this deck meta relevant. And then we have Spiral also coming in at 3.1%. Not surprising, they recently got supported in Illusion of Chaos. From what I understand, makes it, because I say from what I understand, because Spiral is one of those decks that like I don't know at all, and it's very intimidating to me in that regard. But from what I have read / I can gather, the Illusion of Chaos really helps smooth the deck out, because then it's easier to search up a Magician's Souls, which that I know is a pretty important part of the combos that Spiral tends to play out there. Let me take a sip of water real fast here. So these were the standout decks. Again, towards the top, I'm not at all surprised to see the Sprite variants, Runic, Pure, and Twin, and then Branded Despia following it, but I'm a little surprised about the inclusion of some decks, like Dinomorphia, and the exclusion of others, the ones that didn't quite make the cut and are in others. Speaking of other, let's talk about our next section, the Rogues Gallery. So we're going to explore the top decks that were of the other category. And right off the bat here, we can see Sky Striker, Sword Soul Tenyi, Flandries, and Runic. It might be surprising, and it surprises me at least to see Sword Soul Tenyi down here, but it's probably pretty jarring to see these 4 decks now in the other category, not even like represented enough to make the cut on the pie chart, especially Sword Soul Tenyi. That is super shocking. I expect the deck to fall hard in popularity, just because it's like I said before, right? Sword Soul Tenyi just hasn't changed much. It hasn't really changed at all since Halki Fibrex got banned. And I suspect that leads more people to get bored with it. Honestly, myself included, I won't lie, I pretty shortly before recording this video, I played out my games for a Sword Soul Tenyi video that we're going to see probably tomorrow at some point in the next couple of days, I don't know, but it was a little bit, like, I gotta admit, it was a little bit of a slog, I won't lie, to play Sword Soul Tenyi. Not just like in this meta, but like kind of in general. I really hate to say that, because Sword Soul is such, not only a cool deck like lore and theme wise, but like it's what a tier 1 deck should be, right? With the exception of Protos, Sword Soul Tenyi is like a very, very fair deck. I would argue, again with the exception of Protos, that Sword Soul Tenyi is the most fair tier 1 deck I've ever seen in any meta. And this is coming from a Yugi boomer. This is coming from someone who's played literally since Pharaoh's Servant came out at the end of like 2003, right? Sword Soul Tenyi just, it never felt like unfair, the things it was doing. It never felt like ridiculous or like it had to get nerfed into the ground. It just always felt like, yeah, it does the things it does well, but those things that it does are not like, they're not only too overpowered, but they're not too restrictive as far as like putting out a bunch of floodgates or having like a ton of disrupts or so on and so forth. But I think it does also that fairness that is kind of keeping Sword Sultani down, not just in terms of its power level, but like in terms of people wanting to play it right. I do understand the mindset of like, you know, I could get out Chi Xiao plus Baron, right? Or I could play any number of decks that have such a higher ceiling as far as like what they can put out in their boards. They might not be as consistent as Sword Sultani, but you know, they're still going to be like more powerful enough of the time to want to play them over Sword Souls. So yeah, it's like I said, it's sad but not particularly surprising to see Sword Sultani down here. Same with Sky Striker, honestly. Like, Sky Striker, I will maintain, is still an extremely good deck. I think it's probably still a tier 3 deck. I actually don't even remember where I ended up putting it on our most recent tier list. Like, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head, but yeah, it's a deck I really like, but unfortunately, it's just not one that's super, or as great as it was, really, I should say. Sky Striker especially, because it kind of lives and dies. And this is also, honestly, the problem with Sword Sultani, too. Like, Sprites are very much a deck where board breakers tend to be better than disruption because just so often 1 or 2 disrupts is not enough. Sometimes 3 disrupts, or like, I don't know, 4, that's probably enough. But like sometimes 3 disruptions is not even enough to stop Sprites. But 1 or 2 is like honestly rarely enough to stop them from playing out their turn. And you know, Sky Striker and Sword Sultanis kind of really live and die by only putting out a couple of disruptions, right? Like with Sword Sultani, it's most often Chi Xiao plus Baron. Now, ideally, you've also got Protos and or Blackout in addition to those, but, you know, when having to factor in the disruption for our opponent's end, it's, you on average end with Chi Xiao plus Baron, and that's not enough to stop Sprites from doing their plays most of the time. It's really just not enough. And then same thing with Sky Striker here, right? Like, yeah, we can have, like, Widow Anchor plus Shark Cannon, but that might not be enough. Those two, like, might not be enough to deal with your opponents, or your Sprite opponents' stuff there specifically. Let's see, Flonderies and Runic, yeah, it makes sense to see these down here. Labyrinth, you know, Labyrinth has pretty much stayed in this place. Tri-Brigade Spray, I will say I'm a little shocked. I did think this would be higher. I think this would have made the pie chart if you'd asked me to guess whether or not it made the pie chart for these 2 weeks. I thought it would have, but nope. It's not surprising, I guess, to see it below the other variants, because it is most notably the weakest Sprite variant of the quote-unquote main 4 variants that we're seeing right now. I've said this before, but it's really just missing another solid link to, whether that's Pit Knight Airly or Sprite Sprint. Either way, it's just, we really just need another solid link to, and then Tri-Sprite. Like, once Sprite Sprint hits, like, Tri-Sprite gets much better. It's definitely better than Twin Sprite at that point, in my opinion. And it's probably close to, if not on par, maybe even slightly better than Pure Sprite. That's obviously going to be very future dependent on when we get Sprint and what the ban list looks like at that time, but just factoring in the current meta, if we had Sprite Sprint, like, you would definitely expect to see Tri-Sprite far higher up on the tier list here, definitely out of the other category. Let's see, after that we've got Endymion, Adamancipator Dinos, that makes sense. Eldritch, I'm actually surprised to see Eldritch this high, because we haven't seen Eldritch represented, like, at all the last few times we've taken, like, a look at this meta-analysis type of video. Although, I suspect this is honestly because of the alt art. Like, I'm not even kidding, like, I'm not even memeing with that. Like, think about it. We did not see Eldritch, like, at all, for, like, months now, represented on any tier list, even within the Rogues Gallery. And then now, all of a sudden, we're seeing not only a return of Eldritch, but a fairly decent one in terms of its representation. Again, this has got to be due to the alt art. I think as time goes on, we'll start to see Eldritch just completely fall off again. But that said, that alt art does look fabulous. You cannot deny that. Alright, coming up behind those, we've got like Adagnister, Adventure Phantom Knights, 8-Axis Blind Second. These are particularly surprising to see alongside a lot of these other decks. at the top of the other category. Chaos variants just kind of refers to generally like 60 card piles of light and dark monsters that aren't Dragon Link. Interesting that we saw more of those than actual Dragon Link, but what can you do, I guess. The Grid Maju I was kind of tempted to lump into 8X's Blind Second because they're pretty much the same deck except one runs Grid Maju. I don't really know why Master Duel meta kind of differentiated those, but alright. Lyrlusk Tri-Brigade, we actually played this bird up relatively recently, and it performed pretty well, so not surprised to see that here. The Dolce and Numeron, those are kind of like eternal mainstays of the Rogue meta, same with Thunder Dragon and Yumi Control, and Dragon Link, honestly. Dark Magician we've seen quite a bit before with its branded variants, but now we have Illusion of Chaos and other new Dark Magician support with the structure deck, so another reason to play the deck there. After that, we have Heroes, Sharks. Sharks actually recently got top, was it 8 or 16? They got top cut of the last MCS week number 4, which is really cool to see, actually. I thought with the banning of Totally Awesome that decks that, like, rank 4 water decks were kind of just, like, dead in the water, no pun intended, if you can believe it. But, yeah, it's cool to see Sharks still getting represented. Trap Tricks, we probably saw an uptick in these due to Pack running the Trap Tricks structure deck, 3 of those, and doing very well at various events. Now, we don't have a lot of that support, but again, just by virtue of that deck doing well outside of Master Duel, we're seeing it a little bit more represented here. Sun Avalon is kind of left over from the previous meta, where Therions gave it a nice boost in power, and then Subterra is just kind of one of those eternal rogue presences as well. So let's break down some of these notable data trends that we're seeing here. As expected, Spright has made a huge impact upon release in the following forms: Runic, Pure, Twin, and Tri. Those are the 4 variants when I was referring to like the main 4 variants. Those are the ones there. When you combine all of these Spright variants, they make up a total of 39.8% of all Diamond 1 decks reported to Master Duel meta since release. So 40% of all Diamond 1 decks submitted to Master Duel meta have been Spright variants in the last 2 weeks. Not surprising in the slightest. I suspect that number is probably true on a larger scale as well, like even beyond just what was submitted to Master Duel meta, but 40% is quite a bit. It's, I don't know, Spright does feel a decent like head and shoulder above a lot of the other decks that have been on Master Duel so far. But, you know, if you look to the future and you look at stuff like Ishizu cards, Tear Lament, Bystials, you know, this power level that we're seeing from Spright is kind of going to be about the standard of what we're going to see moving forward. So, yeah, I don't think the power level of the meta is going to go back down to like Sword Soul level anytime soon here. Alright, while Runic Spright is represented above other decks by a fair margin, this is likely partially due to factors outside of power level, such as TCG bias and the deck being mostly solved. That aside, Runic Spright is still the most powerful deck of the format. I already pretty much touched upon this point earlier, but yeah, you do have to remember when you're looking at all these decks submitted to Master Duel meta, that it's like 99.9% TCG player, and maybe not quite that much, but it's by and large TCG players, like very much by and large. 98% is probably a realistic figure. TCG players that are submitting this data, and again, Runic Spright, very popular here in the TCG, while it never saw play in the OCG. And now this is just from what I've heard on like Discord and other various social media, but I've heard that OCG Master Duel players value like the Twin and Tri variants higher than the Runic variant. Now, that said, and as I said in this bullet point here, I do personally think Runic Spright is still the most powerful deck of the format. And if I'm being totally honest, it probably does deserve another hit beyond what we're going to see in this ban list that at the time of recording this is coming out tomorrow. So, you know, I don't know. The deck probably does need another hit. I don't know really what that hit would be off the top of my head. It should just be Tip, honestly. Runic Tip needs to go to 1 or 2. I think you could make an argument for Fountain going to 2 as well. That kind of doesn't do a whole lot, though, because Runic Spright pretty much always just plays 2 Fountain anyway, so it's like, that kind of be a pointless hit. And then, I've said this before, and I maintain this point, Fountain to 1 is a death knell for the archetype as a whole, and as much as you dislike an archetype, it's rarely justified to just take it out back with a shotgun, and that's what Fountain to 1 is doing to Runic. So I think Tip could go to 1 or 2. I think that would finally put like a noticeable impact on the deck without just killing it outright. So that would be my proposed fix to Rudic here. All right, let's see here. Okay, next point. Certain decks, such as Sword Sultani and Sky Striker, are likely being underrepresented due to the popularity of sprites. These decks likely perform better than the numbers indicate. I guess I already kind of touched on this point as well. Just because we're not seeing Sky Striker and Sword Sultani represented in the pie chart this time around doesn't mean they're just like done as decks altogether. Indeed, you know, all of these decks hit Diamond 1. Like, when you look back here at like the Rogues Gallery, you might see some of these decks and think like, oh, some of these decks are so bad. Why are we even talking about them? It's because they hit Diamond 1. Like, and that is the thing, that's like the main reason why I like to show what's at the top of the other category when doing these kinds of videos, is to show like, hey, it might seem like it's Sprite or bust right now, but you can definitely still hit top rank with like probably a deck that you really like, if not your favorite deck, is among these, plus what's represented here on the pie chart as well. So there is that to always consider. And indeed, that kind of leads us into our last point here, that despite the prevalence of Sprite, other new support cards such as Illusion of Chaos and the Punk Deer Note, they've been able to breathe life into decks that haven't seen as much play recently, even pre-Sprite. Like, we never really saw, I mean, we still occasionally, but we more rarely saw like Dark Magician, Spiral, all these like cool like 60 card kind of variants that Punk isn't able to ninja in. Yeah, I think it's worth noting that, you know, despite how prevalent Sprite is in the meta, there are still other decks that are very, very viable. Now, does Sprite itself need to hit? The answer is probably yes, but in what capacity, I'm not sure. Sprite Elf could probably go to 1 in Master Duel. I think that would be fine. That wouldn't kill Sprite variants, but it would make sticking and protecting that elf a lot more important. It would make you consider how you use that elf a lot more. Indeed, we saw the card actually banned in the TCG. Now, granted, I don't think they're going to hit Sprite cards anytime soon here, but I would make an argument that elf could go to 1. Starter maybe could go to 1 as well. I think that would be fine. I think if Elf and Starter went to 1, we would see Sprites in general in a more balanced place. But I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. And that's also within the scope of this current meta. As future support comes out that, as I mentioned, is about on par with the power level of Sprite, they're probably going to need those Elves to keep up with those decks, honestly. But it's going to largely depend on what gets released and in what order. So really, only time will tell in that regard. But I think that's about everything I wanted to cover as far as this metagame analysis, so let's just go ahead and move now to our outro. Alright everybody, thank you so much for watching all the way to the very end of the video like this. That means a whole lot to me, not just personally, but it's also a great way of supporting the channel as well. If you're interested in supporting the channel in other means, you can of course feel free to comment and or subscribe right here on YouTube. I'm always looking to the comments section. You guys leave some pretty awesome feedback as far as like constructive criticism goes when it comes to deck building, gameplay, channel content, all that stuff. So feel free to leave your opinion down there. I will be sure to take a look at that there. And then subscribing is going to be the best way to get notifications of when these videos drop. That does happen every day, by the way, so if you're looking for daily Master Duel content, you've come to the right place. And there are more places where you can get some daily Master Duel content. If you check out the description below, follow the top link over to my Patreon page. There for just $5 a month, which is as much as you pay for a booster pack. You'll find a lot more value than a pack full of filler over there. We've got some previews for content upcoming here on the channel. We've got some exclusive games that are only posted over on Patreon over there. We've got some Q&As, and then you can also have your name featured in this lovely credit sequence where I thank all of the people who are helping contribute over there on Patreon. It's a huge support to the channel, and it really means a lot as well. So thank you everyone who is donating that is featured here on screen. And again, you know, it's not just a pure donation, you do get some more daily Master Duel content over there just for being a part of the Patreon. But I think that's about all the time that I have for today's video. Once again, I just want to thank you so very much for sticking all the way to the end of the video. Again, it just means a lot as I do put a decent amount of work into getting these videos out every single day. But that's about all the time that I've got for now, so without further ado, this is Xlex. I'm signing out, and I hope you have a fantastic day.